In all of our countries at the moment, in all the sort of liberal Western democracies, we've become incredibly bad at talking. And because we've become bad at talking, we've become bad at thinking.
In the last few months, there has been a flurry of loud and angry debates about what can be said and what ideas can be expressed.
Why did the mob keep coming for people who misspoke on things to do with gender or race or sexuality? And people learn from that. They learn not to speak.
Why do you believe you were fired?
That's the sort of dark stuff you get into if you don't have a more honest conversation. I think it's the self-appointed task of those of us who do not have wobbly hierarchies over us to speak. One of the things I think a lot of us have started to notice and become worried about in recent years is weaponization of identity. You're not talking about politics. You are only fighting a battle to win. I'm not up for equality and then pretend that men and women don't exist, or that gender is just something you perform. I'm not just agreeing to say whatever the crazy shit is that everyone's being told to say today. They say that I'm the bigot. They don't mention that I'm gay because it doesn't help them. We have to find a way to de-derange ourselves and get on to things that we ought to be doing. I don't think there's any harm in open conversation. We could answer lots of things we need to answer. We could get to the truth. We can do an immense amount of good with that as a species, as people.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
The first time I saw Douglas Murray was on stage at the O2 Arena in front of a packed house of 7,000 or 8,000 people. He was moderating a debate between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Jordan came in the studio here the next day to talk about his ideas, and now Douglas is out with his book called The Madness of Crowds. And he's here to challenge what we think we know about race and gender and identity. Douglas has been writing for places like The Spectator and The Times and The Wall Street Journal for many, many years. And he's pushing back on a narrative you might have heard on social media or other forms of media. And he thinks we've gone too far in some of these categories. I don't agree with everything Douglas has to say, but I think it's good to have an alternative point of view so we can debate some of these ideas. So I look forward to your comments below, and I hope you enjoy my time with Douglas. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Douglas Murray, the British author, journalist, and political commentator. You are an associate editor of the British political and cultural magazine, The Spectator, and also write for The Times and The Wall Street Journal. Your new book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity, reveals the new culture wars playing out in our workplaces, schools, and homes in the name of social justice, identity politics, and intersectionality. Douglas, welcome to London Real.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you here. I wonder if we could just start and ask, after your previous book, The Strange Death of Europe, why write this book next? Why write this book now? And I guess part of me wants to ask you, is this what everyone's thinking on the inside anyways, and just not talking about?
That's what I think.
Okay.
In The Strange Death of Europe, I looked at immigration questions in Europe, Islam, and other topics most people want to keep away from. And I found, to my enormous pleasure, a wonderful audience in all sorts of countries, so many countries, and so many people who just seemed to me, and this is the best thing ever for an author, because as an author you put a book out and you don't know if anyone's going to read it, but seemed to me to gain satisfaction and pleasure, encouragement in a way, from the fact that somebody was thinking about this and was trying to address the things they were trying to address. And what I realized was, of course, is that in all of our countries at the moment, in all the sort of liberal Western democracies, we've become incredibly bad at talking. And because we've become bad at talking, we've become bad at thinking. And I'd noticed the things that are the main subjects in the madness of crowds. I'd noticed them for years, and I started looking into them. Why did people's careers keep on getting destroyed over the same things? Why did the mob keep coming for people who misspoke on things to do with gender or race or sexuality? And what was really going on? And I wanted to look into that. I wanted to explain it. And to say basically what I think people want to be thinking about. Because I don't think there's any harm in open conversation. I don't think there's any harm in actual exchange of ideas. I have a real confidence that bad ideas get chased out by good ones. I've got a sort of unbelievable confidence in this idea. And I think our societies don't have that confidence anymore. In fact, we seem terrified of ideas, terrified of bad ideas. The bad ideas might catch on and then we'll all become bad. No, if you allowed yourself to have the conversation, then the bad ideas can't win. So, yeah, having trodden on one set of landmines, I decided to go hopping merrily across all the rest.
Were you concerned when you published your previous book that you might be completely vilified and no one was going to read it and people were going to hate you?
I don't know. I was. I've written 5 books now, and wrote my first book when I was 18. And I view it as being, you write things, you put them out there, you hope there's a readership. But I don't particularly mind about the response. I mean, you want a good response, but that's not why I write. I wasn't so worried about criticism on the last book. I was worried about some of the subjects I was over then are really dangerous subjects. And I know that to my own cost, and a lot of friends have discovered that at their own cost. So I was worried about that a little bit. But again, I mean, you have to weigh these things up. Is it better to talk or not to talk, to speak or not to speak? And I think it's better to speak.
Mm. And that's really what this book is about. It's about having these conversations that right now are unpopular,
Yeah.
and typically, maybe mostly on social media, seem to be completely dominating the conversation and going in very, very strange ways. And I know you travel the world and meet people. I meet people all the time, and yet I don't have these conversations with real people in person. They seem to a lot of times happen out there.
What sort of conversation?
The ones where we are vilifying someone for doing this, or there's a big stink about someone saying something about,
the scandal culture.
Yeah, all that seems to sometimes happen mostly in the Twitterverse and not always in real life.
That's true, but sometimes these two things meet. In fact, they meet a lot these days.
Yeah.
You see, I think we're all lying about a whole range of things, and mainly to do with these issues I address in The Madness of Crowds. And I think that there's a cost to that, as I say, of bad ideas seeping into the whole system. And individuals in their lives, I think, know this and can feel it. Not everybody, but broadly speaking by now, if you don't think that the sort of woke intersectional culture is coming for you, then it's only because you're self-employed. Like, the only people I know who aren't now worried about this are self-employed. They don't go into an office. They don't need to speak to people. I mean, everybody you see, people used to think it was just the education field or academia or something. And then one of the things I discovered as I was researching this book was, no, it's everywhere. It's like the corporate world. People in big banks and big corporations and energy companies and media, of course. They all have these diversity departments and diversity enforcement departments and human resources departments and all these sorts of things, which are in some companies the only really growing bit of the company. I mean, they're doing really well, some of these human resources people. But so many people I've spoken to in recent years, they're trying to work this stuff out because it's all being imposed on them. And of course, it's got some good in it. It's got some good intentions in it. It's just what it's going to lead us to all is hell. So everybody's sort of thinking about this, but they're not able to speak about it. And if they do, they are a serious likelihood of losing their job. I mean, there are very, very famous examples of people who've just slipped up once. You know, Tim Hunt, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, does a joke at a conference in South Korea. And one woman in the room says that it's a sexist joke, and by the time he's back in the UK, he's fired from every position. Every position. There are cases, famous cases like the James Damore case in Google. You know, Google says they want some ideas. This, tech guy gives some ideas, bang, he's out. And people learn from that. They learn not to speak, not to air worries and concerns. So I think it's the self-appointed task of those of us who do not have wobbly hierarchies over us to speak.
And that's why writers can talk about this stuff more freely than a lot of other people.
I think we're the only people who can now.
Right. And with James at Google, it was interesting because he really put together a very articulate argument about talking about, I think it was why there are more men coders than women at Google. And Google's an intelligent company, but at the same time, they were living in a reactionary culture and they kind of had to do something. And so the smartest decision for them was to get rid of him. Yeah. But it didn't really make a lot of sense logically.
Yeah. Well, that's because there are lies we tell ourselves. And you need to enforce the lie. And you need to enforce the lie by punishment beatings of truth tellers. So if you say, maybe there are some differences between the sexes, whoa, you're already in trouble. I mean, you're going into dangerous terrain already. And really what it is there are a whole set of things in our society that we don't look at because we know what the answers can't be. And if somebody comes up with one of the answers that it can't be, you've got to shut them up. You've got to get rid of them.
What's an example of that?
Well, as I say, the Damore case is a very good example.
Right.
But that happens with some regularity. Because there are very painful things that keep coming up. I mention in the book, in the race chapter, one of the reasons I'm so worried about this retreat to identity and this retreat to characteristics is everything down the road from it is hell. And I write in the race chapter in The Madness of Crowds about the Harvard admissions scandal, which is extraordinary. And there is an example of trying not to come to certain conclusions and as a result, doing terrible things. This is, for anyone who doesn't know, this is a lawsuit taken out against Harvard by a group of Asian students who say that the admissions procedure, in order to try to introduce fairness into the admissions process at Harvard and to allow people of various ethnic backgrounds to get in, was prejudiced against Asian students because they knew that more Asian students would be able to get in than other ethnic groups, and so they downgraded all Asian applicants on character traits without meeting them. And that's the sort of dark stuff you get into if you don't have a more honest conversation. And, I understand some of the fear because honest conversations can be dangerous anyway. They can be risky. They can certainly be hurtful. But in the end, what's better? Going through a bit of that pain or making an entire society go through the pain of constantly reinforcing lies?
You make this analogy in the book with St. George and slaying the dragon. Maybe you can talk about that because you kind of look back and say, okay, we were fighting for women's rights, we were fighting for gay rights and racial rights kind of in 50s, 60s, 70s and made some great progress and then kept fighting. And now we're to a point where a lot of people want to fight, but we're not sure If there's anything to kill, maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful phrase that the late Australian political philosopher Ken Minogue came up with in a book of his called The Liberal Mind. He identified a certain type of person who is keen on the revolutionary attitude, keen to be at the barricades. He called it St. George in retirement syndrome, that St. George, after slaying the dragon and getting all the acclaim of slaying the dragon, might be tempted to go around the land finding more dragons to slay. And there being a deficit of dragons in the land, might end up swinging his sword at smaller and smaller beasts until eventually he might be found swinging his sword at thin air. Well, I don't say that there's no dragon-like thing left to slay in our society. I don't say that everything's perfect, but there is a lot in that, in the febrile, furious atmosphere of our times, where when things have never been better, they're portrayed as if they've never been worse. For all minorities, for women, and this idea, I understand why people have it. I mean, I understand why people wish they'd been with Martin Luther King at the March on Washington. I have a few friends who were there and tell me about it, and it's fantastic. It's just thrilling in the telling. I understand that people might want to be there. I understand that some people wish they'd been at the Stonewall Inn, I get that. But I would urge that instead of thinking, therefore, I will fight as hard now as they did then, even if the stakes are minimal or non-existent, I would say, why not just enjoy the fruits of your predecessors' legacies and bravery and do something better with your life now? But that isn't the attitude of our time. The attitude of our time is an audition after the fact to be right in the center of the melee.
Now, you chose to break this book down into 4, issues or types. So it's race, gay, women, and trans. Was that difficult to nail it down to those 4? Was it ever going to be 3 or 5?
There were a couple more I could have done and decided not to. You could put some of the green stuff in this,
right?
Because it's definitely taking on whatever the debates on the science. There's definitely a religious aspect to it now. I think is almost undebatable.
You say religious. Explain that.
Oh, the paying of indulgences in carbon tax, the belief in primordial original sin, the expiation of guilt. It's got something that most post-religion religions don't have, in that it not only has the guilt but the way to atone for the guilt, which is clever and attractive. I could also have done one I did think of but decided to avoid because it sort of seeps through the whole thing, is mental health. I think there's a huge discussion to be had about all sorts of complex things about why mental health has become the issue it has, what in it is totally plausible and what we're behind on understanding, and what is being overreached in that debate. But I decided that those were the green one is being done quite a lot, and the mental health one I think needs a lot of time and space on its own. And it's not quite as deep a tripwire at the moment because it's still sort of asserting itself as an issue. Yeah. But everything to do with LGBT, relations between the sexes and race are just, they're the nature of almost every day's news. They are the thing that can get anyone, irrespective of everything else they've done. I give the example of the Nobel Prize winner Tim Hunt, but a cabinet, we're sitting in London, former defense minister here was found to have 15 years earlier put his hand on a female journalist's knee. She smacked it away and said, if you do that again, you're getting a smack around the chops. That was it. That was the end of the incident. Now you can say, well, that's bad behavior, obviously. But 15 years after that happened, somebody wrote about it, and he had to resign. And I just find that fascinating, because that's a defense minister. Like that's a serious role,
right.
and it's seriously interesting that, as I say, I'm not saying that's great. Like I'm not saying everyone should put their hands on the knees of the person beside them at dinner, anything like it. It's just the assertion of a certain set of moral norms in our time, including behavioral norms, is shifting, has been shifting very, very fast, with, I think, just not very much discussion. And I mean, that's why I wanted to do the women chapter in the way I did, was to say, what are the things, at the same time as there are things that we pretend we know about that we don't really know about. Like, we don't know as much about gay as we pretend. We know relatively little, and we definitely know very little, nearly nothing about trans. But we pretend to be incredibly certain about these things. Oh, well, that person's trans. They say they're trans. Yeah. But at the same time, you have these things which everyone knew till yesterday, and they pretended they didn't know, or they've forgotten, or we never did know. And that one, the most striking example of that is in relations between the sexes.
Okay. And you have 3 interludes in here, which is interesting, and one is on forgiveness.
Yeah.
Or trying to, like you said, maybe look at something that happened in the past, right, and maybe not react to it and understand and forgive it. Also, you mentioned technology in there, which is kind of fascinating. And then I think the Marxist piece there.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk on each one of the 4 issues, but maybe the technology is something that links a lot of it together, and maybe it's something worth talking about.
Yeah.
I watched a very interesting discussion with Jack Dorsey and Joe Rogan. You were on Joe's show. He actually went on twice, and it was interesting. We brought his lawyer back the second time, and they went through all of their policies on how they moderate Twitter, and how they're very sensitive to a lot of issues around trans issues and things. And they have their laws, which have nothing to do with any other laws in sovereign states, but it's kind of the way they moderate things. And I found it really interesting about how this is okay, that's not okay. A lot of things around trans, like you said, which I guess maybe we're just starting to understand. What do you see in that space?
And you know they lie.
About what they do or why they do it. Because it's a corporation.
You know they lie.
Explain that.
The tech companies, I mean, I have actually seen the lists of some of the words that are the things that get you in trouble. Twitter is one of the worst, because Twitter doesn't tell people.
So double standard, you're saying. They have a list of what gets you in trouble, and then there's what really gets you in trouble.
And the ways that they mute people and pretend they don't. The way they pretend they just can't do things at the moment, which they do. And it's political. It's political. And it's taken a while for some people to realize that, but it's nakedly political. The same with Google. I give an example in the tech chapter, as you know, about Google Images. And it's just fascinating, because most people it doesn't occur to most people that when you type something into the search engine, what you're getting back isn't true, or not real, or not really representative of what you wanted to get. And one of the examples I give is Google Images, which is just fascinating. If you go to Google Images and you say, I would like to see, type in, anyone can do it now, I mean, or they might, now I've pointed it out, they may skew the algorithm back, but say you want to see photos of gay couples, just put gay couples into Google image search. You'll get lots of nice photos of nice, happy gay couples. A lot of mixed race couples, just to, accentuate the positive. But there's lots of nice gay couples. Happy gay life. Do straight couples. You don't get what you asked for. You don't get what you asked for. You get a lot of gays, awful lot of gays.
When you Google straight couples?
Yeah.
Okay.
You get a lot of mixed race, a lot of black photos of black couples. You get. It doesn't want to give you what you're asking.
Why?
Because.
And is this intentional?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So some people thought this was just machine learning fairness, which I explain about in the book, but it's not just machine learning fairness, which is a fascinating subject on its own. It's machine learning fairness with a human intervention. The same thing happens if you do, here's another really dangerous one, do black couples. You get black couples, you get happy black couples. And just picture after picture. Do white couples, you get black couples. Mixed race, you get very early, you get a mixed race gay couple with black children.
And so why?
Why? Because Google wants to say, how dare you be searching for that, you bigot. What kind of a monster would be searching for straight couples or white couples? Bigot. We'll show you. We'll give you gays. We'll give you black gays. We'll force feed you things you didn't want, you didn't ask for, because only a bigot would be searching for that. And now, it's fascinating, but the most interesting thing is that most people don't know it's going on. As I say, I mean, it's not like, there are all these stats on the number of school-aged children that think that when you Google a question, that things come up in order of truth. There are all these studies of that, and you have to. One of the things, of course, with people growing up, children growing up in the internet age, is to make sure they're educated to not think that sort of thing, and it's very hard for them. It's very hard for everybody. But I know very few adults or children who know that this stuff I've just described is going on. And by the way, it's not. I say that what is happening with that in tech is just a sped up version of something that's happening in the rest of the media. I mean, I have a bit of fun in one of the chapters, I think it's a chapter on gay, about just one day in the life of the New York Times, where the lead business story is 2 pages about a gay Japanese businessman who's come out in his firm. And it's not a problem because Japan doesn't have a particularly homophobic society or anything. Okay. If you're just like a businessman in New York that morning and you open the business section, why do you need to have just the front 2 pages about a gay Japanese businessman who came out and it wasn't a problem? It's not just a definition of not business news, it's not really news. And the same day had the culture section was a story about how 2 male ballet dancers of the New York City Ballet were dancing together in a scene that had previously been for a man and a woman. And, because obviously it's very important to stress that the otherwise wildly heterosexual world of ballet is, has been gayed up a bit.
And so why is this happening in the New York Times?
Well, because
are they responding to what people want?
They're doing the same thing.
Right. That's their agenda.
That's the thing that is happening, and which the tech companies are just doing faster.
Okay.
There's just it's partly a post-Trump thing, it's partly a post-Brexit thing. We've got a lot of our sense-making mechanisms have broken down, and a lot of our organs in fact, all of our organs of communication have broken down pretty much. And it's partly because of this, that instead of being the thing that tells us what is happening, they have to stand equidistant between the facts and the public and negotiate between the two. Because you can't have the public, because they can't be trusted with facts. You've got to interpret them for the public. Now, of course, that's always happened to some degree. But this version, the retributive version of it, that's like, giving you more gay stuff than you want will be good for you, because it'll smoke out the bigots.
Okay, so they're giving you more gay stuff than you want, more pro-minority group stuff than you want, more pro-trans stuff than you want,
oh, yeah,
and more pro-feminist stuff than you want, or
yeah, and I think and the hysterical attitude always coming to the fore. I mean, we have this with the sort of Margaret Atwood obsession, the idea that that it's likely that women in America are soon to be living in a situation akin to that of women in Tehran in 1980.
I mean, I read the New York Times too, and I see this as well.
Yeah.
And there's more. It's the
yeah.
the environmental stuff and the anti-Trump stuff. It's just like, it just kind of front loads with that, to where I can kind of see the article. I'm like, oh, of course it's that, and it's really noticeable.
Yeah, and they are doing it. There's an easy way to do this, which you just blame the New York Times. You blame the editors. No, it's the public as well, because You know, recently the New York Times ran a headline about Trump called after another massacre in the US, called for unity in the face of racism, I think it was.
Yeah.
It's what you'd expect, what you'd hope the president would do. He does it, of course, that's what he does. And the New York Times just reports that, the president calls for unity. And the backlash from the Times subscribers means that they have to change the headline so it doesn't look like they're saying that is what Trump said and they're not criticizing it. They're like, they have to make it into, well, he said that, but he wouldn't really mean it because we know he's a bigot. Because that's what the readers are demanding. So it's not just that the sort of people in power or in influence, we're doing this to ourselves. We're trying to cut off our sources of information ourselves.
Are we ashamed of who we are? Are we
I don't know. I think a lot of people are bored.
Bored. And they want the drama. They want a victim. They want a battle.
Funnily enough, there's a reading of Hegel where this is predicted, where the person at the end of history, as Hegel would have it, benefits from all of these things. All of the forebears, gets to the position, has been got to the position that one would want to be in, of being in a free state, a free society with all of these attainments in the way of rights. And that at that point, we might rebel for the sake of rebellion, for addiction to the rebellious attitude, and thus bring the whole thing down. So Hegel saw some of that, and others have as well. It's not far off what we're doing. It's not far off. And I think, people understate the effect of things like boredom. Like, people want to be heroic. Not everyone, but a lot of people want to be sort of heroic or seen to be heroes or seen to be virtuous. Just because you lose religion doesn't mean you lose the things that people want from religion, including the perception of your peers that you are a person of virtue. And if you lose the old religious virtues, you've got to create new ones.
So no more crusades. You got to make up your own crusade.
Yeah, and my gosh, have they made them up. And with all those other things, of course, that we know from Girard and others, that the need to get a scapegoat, And it's particularly useful if the scapegoat is somebody who has committed a crime which you've committed a version of yourself in the past and need to expiate your own mixed feelings about that, your contorted human feelings about that by taking it out so vengefully on the person you can find.
Okay. Is this in the Me Too movement?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I had Rose McGowan in that seat about 6 months ago, and it was a very interesting conversation with Rose, and I appreciate what you went through. And at the end I said, Rose, I've seen things like Neil deGrasse Tyson, whose season of Cosmos has been put on hold, and from what I could read, it was thin, really thin. And I said, how do you feel about things like this happening where entire careers are being taken out where, look, I don't know the details. Of course, he was later exonerated and the show came back, but it looked thin. And I'd had Neil on the show as well.
Right.
And she looked at me and she said, that's collateral damage.
Right.
And I was really surprised she said that, but she said, yeah, it's
I
not
admire
right.
her for saying it.
Yeah,
I admire
did
her
too.
for saying it.
She said, that's just what happened of the course of these other things happening. And it was interesting to hear that.
An interesting question to ask in that situation, I had this yesterday with a journalist from The Guardian I was in discussion with, is because I hear a version, there's very few people are as honest as she was to you, but there was an example I give it in the book of a CNN presenter who says at the height of Me Too, okay, maybe it is an overcorrection. Well, we're due an overcorrection.
Right, I remember that.
Now, one of the questions I would have for such a person, I had it yesterday with this Guardian journalist, was if that is your view, please tell us what your mechanisms are for correcting the overcorrection, when you might see it as being necessary, and who might call it. Because I think in a lot of the rights claims, I think this is the case in LGBT issues, women's issues, racial equality issues, it's understandable if when you have a group that have been oppressed in some way in the past, that you get to equality, and at the point you're at equality, you might want to run a bit further to make up for lost time, or sort of hit further in order to get the pendulum more correctly in the position you want to get it to. You might overcorrect in order to at some point swing back to normal. That's why I say we've had this strange period, we are still in this strange period where in some ways it's better to be gay than straight. Better. You got an extra card. You got something going for you. Not like that loser straight guy. Okay? So it went from gays 60 years ago against the law to equality, one of the most magnificent movements. And then you go to better. And I loathe better. I loathe it. And the same thing happens in other situations.
And this is speaking as a gay man.
Sure.
Are people surprised when they find that out about you, based on what you write about?
I don't know. I mean, I loathe arguments from one's own characteristics. So, I mean,
even though that's a lot what happens out there.
Oh, it's the only thing that happens out there.
Right.
I noticed that years ago in audiences, people would say, speaking as a, and I just bristled. It doesn't matter. The content of your point is what matters, not what you're speaking. I don't care if you're a Puerto Rican woman or a Puerto Rican man or an American, or from Manchester. It doesn't matter. What's your point? Now, everyone else pretty much in this age has decided it's only about the speaker, nothing about the speech. But yes, just to get back to this point, this same thing has been happening others. So, and I quote the very brilliant young American writer called Coleman Hughes, I quote in the introduction. He says, at his time at university in America, he noticed that there were people who seemed to behave around him, he happens to be black, he seemed to behave around him as if there was some special heightened moral knowledge that came from being black. Now, of course, there are a lot of black people who will have some heightened moral knowledge depending on their circumstances, just as there will be some white people and some Chinese people and all sorts of people who will have some heightened moral knowledge. But the idea that everybody with a particular characteristic has it is like the flip side of racism, to put it at its politest. And so we got to this stage with black that's a bit like the gay one, like it's better. Again, it's understandable, if particularly with America's history of racial problems. Yeah. It's understandable. Like, when would you know you've lent too heavily on that? And when have you gone past equal and got to better? And how can we just get back to equal again?
Because going past can be very destructive and dangerous too.
And the Me Too thing hits the women's one on this because, okay, we'll overcorrect. Okay, we might punish a generation of heterosexual men. Good. We'll give them some of that. Okay, really? When will you stop that? And who will call time? Who will stop this zero-sum game of vengefulness? And by the way, what's interesting about that, among other things, that this is an English-speaking world phenomenon in particular. I don't say it doesn't happen elsewhere, but it's particularly bad in the English-speaking world. And I have an example of this, by the way, which is on my mind a lot because I travel all the time. I think I said I'm in a different country every week, pretty much, and I get around a lot. And versions of this are everywhere. But France, for instance, when the Me Too thing happens, there is when people see that here is somebody who's clearly been behaving in an inappropriate way and possibly trials committing an illegal way. That has to be addressed. It has to be stopped and an example made. Absolutely. But when it becomes clear that you've got things like the Ansari case, a comedian in America who suffered, I think, as Barry Weiss said at the time, bad date etiquette perhaps on both parts, a bit fuzzy and so on.
Yeah.
When you see those people being destroyed, it's really striking to me that it was France that has 100 very prominent women, some of whom are friends of mine in France, actresses, intellectuals, thinkers, and leading figures in France who happen to be women, write a joint letter saying, this has gone too far. Men and women have to still get on. We have to get on. And
why do they say that?
Well, because, because they're more sensible about that. For all sorts of reasons which are fascinating in themselves. But broadly, could we have found 3 or 4 women in equivalently prominent positions in America or Britain at the height of that to say, look, we might be overcorrecting, No, but everyone wanted to keep their heads down, including women. I know, but of course they did, because this is how people's lives get destroyed. You don't want to be the one person who sticks your head above the parapet, just as everyone else of your sex is stampeding the other way.
We saw it happen. A couple people stuck their heads up and they were gone. So, and why the French? Culturally? Are they not in this kind of this madness of the English-speaking Twitterverse echo chamber? Are they just kind of removed from it one step?
Well, I think, you have to be so careful what you wish for. I remember years ago, sometimes something happens and you feel responsible and you realize you can't be responsible, but just something you said once. But some years ago, I remember dinner with some friends, and I can't remember what it was. It was something just mad had happened that day. It's about 10 years ago. And I remember saying to a friend, God, don't you sometimes want a dose of Presbyterianism to come back into the society? A bit of Puritanism would come in useful here. And I remember one of these friends being quite shocked. He said, Douglas, you can't mean that. I said, well, I sort of don't really, but it would be, you could quite do with a moral force that reins some of this in a little bit.
Right.
And then, of course, it did happen. It just came back, as always happens, from a totally different direction than any that I could foresee. It didn't come up from like black-hatted Puritan Cromwellian figures from the 17th century. It came with a movement calling itself a social justice movement that decided to embed a new form of norms, particularly in relations between the sexes, that makes the Puritans look like Play-Doh.
And that's what's happening
That's
today.
what's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, a friend of mine in her 50s, I said to me recently, we were on holiday together, and she said, Douglas, darling, I feel like people must have felt at the Regency just before Queen Victoria came in. She said, I like sex, And I like men. She said, I feel like a libertine.
You mentioned that this might be rooted in the economic collapse in 2008, and there's this weird Marxism going on here. And it was kind of interesting to read that in the book. And obviously it's part of kind of the interlude, which is maybe kind of the underlying fabric or structure about how these things come up. Can you just talk about that idea, that theory?
Yeah, in between doing these main chapters on gay, women, race, and trans, I wanted to flesh some of it out, where it comes from. I'm often asked, particularly by students, young people, and like, where does this come from? And of course, you can trace some of it. Some of it's very hard to trace. Some of it you just got to, keep looking into. But one of the things that's very clear is the Marxist substructure of some of this. It keeps revealing itself in, among other things, the perception that this is all to do with power. See, I think this is a really ugly game we've all got caught in. And it's basically being done on Marxist and post-Marxist terms. The perception that everything in our lives is mainly to do with power. A lot of people imbibe this from Foucault, who, by the way, he's the most cited scholar. If you look at Google Scholar, he's the most cited scholar, Foucault. It's not a small figure. He's cited like 4 times more than Einstein in academic papers. And he's a very brilliant thinker in a way. But he embeds a whole set of really ugly ideas, and one is viewing basically everything, including sexual relations, solely through the lens of power. And I think that power is significant. I think it's interesting, it's important. But if you said to most people, well, what motivates you in your life? How many people would say power? No. Love? Family, friendships, forgiveness, God? All sorts of things. Power? Yeah, it's a force. There are a lot of forces in the world. And there's something perverse about seeing everything through this prism. But the Marxist part of it is partly to do with that, and the idea there's a sort of structure in society, which in the old days was the workers at the bottom holding up the structure, and on their shoulders the middle classes, and then up and up and up until you get to the sort of aristocracy and capital. Well, that was the sort of the Marxist understanding of how society was structured, which was a perverse understanding in its own way, for lots of reasons. But there's a version of this that is in the social justice movement, which is that basically the pyramid is differently organized. I mean, you might have gays and black people and people of color and women in various bits, but at the top is capital. and particularly white male elderly capital. And that keeps revealing itself as the version of society that a lot of people believe is our society. It's just that. And therefore you need to bring it down. And this is a sort of form of Marxist interpretation, which I also trace, by the way, that the number of Marxist academics and writers and thinkers who were working on this. I mean, it didn't come from nowhere.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.